All right, it's 1:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the NNP Symposium, or to Central States if you are here in person. All of our presentations in this room are also being live streamed out as part of the NNP Symposium, which began as an online-only event in 2020. We now have some hybrid experiences working with Central States. So the presentation this hour is going to kick off our Iowa State Showcase. It's part of a whole program that Central States is starting this year, where each year they're highlighting a different member state, starting with Iowa. So we have 5 total talks over the next 3 days, focusing on things related to Iowa numismatics or from members of the club, starting off with Scott Hansen on early Iowa coin and currency. Scott is the president of the Ames Coin Club, the vice president of the Iowa Numismatic Association, and a longtime collector of Iowa obsolete items. So I will turn it over to Scott, and I'll be back at the end for the Q&A.
Thank you. Well, for this afternoon's show, and kind of as a tie-in for the Iowa Showcase, one of the things that the INA talked about was maybe talking a little bit about coin and currency from Iowa's earlier periods. And this kind of focuses on items from when Iowa was at the end of the Wisconsin territorial period to the Civil War, when the national banknote started. So, kicking things off here, just a little bit of a background for what was going on. So Iowa became its own territory in 1838, and we'll actually go a couple years before this for the Wisconsin territory. Stayed in 1846. Population was small at the time, so about 1/6 of what it is today. So a smaller population, that means less coin currency needed, so there's not as much out there as some of the more established states. And also at that date, Iowa got into issuing paper money quite a bit later than a lot of the eastern states, so there's just not as much out there as you can find for other states to collect. So like the railroad didn't come in until 1856, and so everything kind of came in by riverboats, horse, stagecoach, that kind of thing. So not easy to move things around. But specie, gold and silver coin, that was really the money of the day. Paper money was more of a necessity, just because there's always a shortage of coin. The mint really couldn't keep enough coin in circulation until the 1870s to kind of meet everyone's demand for commerce. So that hole was kind of filled by paper money issued by about everybody can think of. So the states, towns, banks, merchants, that kind of thing. So not always trustworthy, not always reliable. A lot of that value always depended on the reputation of the issuer. Any type of situation that came up where they questioned whether they had enough money to exchange your currency for coin would trigger a financial panic or a run on that bank, and those notes would no longer be accepted by merchants or anybody in the area. So it's kind of a rough time if you had paper money and on how you used it, and if it still had value the next day sometimes. So I said the mint, this is when the mint was turning out the seeded Liberty dollar sets, the gold eagles, 3 cents silver, and the large size cent and half. These were all usually pretty prevalent on the East Coast, but as you moved in towards the western side of the state, I always have trouble thinking that Iowa at this time was the west side of civilization. So sometimes we still think we're in the middle of nowhere, but that's the way it goes. But so a lot of these things didn't ever get this far, and so it was rare that these things were seen in commerce. So kind of make up for that, foreign coins stayed in circulation. The Spanish dollar had always been around. That was kind of a prevalent thing for the colonial times, and it continued on through 1857. A lot of other states or other countries' coins were also accepted. There's kind of a whole industry built around this. So you have these manuals or publications that would come out that would tell you what the value of all the foreign coins were. This is always based on how much silver or gold and the fineness that was in each coin. No exchange rate, just kind of a simple how much gold and silver and how good a quality it is. Iowa was lucky enough to have a couple early bankers that did a lot of articles for the State Historical Society, which actually got started about the same time. One of them is Hoyt Sherman. He was a Des Moines banker. A lot of the things that he talked about is what he saw back then in his day. Is he said gold coin, when you could get it, was typically the English sovereign, the French 20 franc, and the Spanish doubloon. silver, always the Spanish dollar, and then later on the Mexican dollar when that changed over. And then in Iowa City, banker Hiram Price, he talked about the French 5 franc piece, which was worth about 95 cents at the time, the Spanish quarter. And obviously when they needed a smaller coin like the rest of the country, they cut up the Spanish dollars into pieces. So, a quarter of the dollar was 2 bits or 25 cents. Half of that was 12.5 cents. And if you got the bit in half, you got down to 6.25 cents. That was kind of a small change. That was the preference back then, because that was a known quantity, and the silver was always a measurable item on there. And then another publication he had talked later on, I didn't kind of understand the Spanish quarter, as those were used enough and they wore smooth. Once the design went off, then they would start accepting 20 cents. So apparently there's 5 cents worth of silver in the design on those. Since coinage was short, paper money was really the bulk of what was happening in Iowa in this time period. Another thing that made coins harder to find in circulation was Iowa was being developed, surveyed. Land sales was a big thing. So land speculation was one of the big drivers of this time period. And President Jackson put his executive order in that basically land sales had to be done with silver or gold coin. And so all the coin in the market ended up going into the land purchases, and the government land agency would then send that back to the treasury. So you're still pulling all the money out of the state that way. So paper money, there's always a lot of ways to collect and organize things. Just kind of for this presentation, kind of broke it down into time periods, just kind of as the money progressed over the years. So the Wisconsin territorial period, the Iowa first constitution, that first constitution area, basically the government was against banks issuing money. So Iowa was prohibited from having its own currency, basically. So you had to rely on banks outside the state and bring their money in, which was problematic because you didn't control them. So it might have value today, it might not have value tomorrow. So pretty hard to run your business when you don't have any control over what you're using. And then by the second constitution, they decided that, well, we need something more reliable, so they relaxed some of those things, and that turned that all around. So Shoreland, Wisconsin territory, for an Iowa tie-in anyways. Basically, we had 2 banks. The Miners Bank was really the main banking facility at the time in Dubuque, Iowa. Commerce there was all centered around the lead mines that had been there for a number of years. The Miners Bank had 4 different issues of currency. The first one was Wisconsin territory, like this one on the screen, and then the other 2 middle 2 issues all noted Iowa territory, and the last one just said Iowa. I'm guessing it never was really Iowa because the territorial government spent its whole time period trying to revoke their charter because they were very much against banks and banks of issue. And so about 6 months before statehood, they revoked the bank's charter and shut it down. So it never actually got to the statehood point. And it's kind of ironically, one of the reasons they shut it down was when you issued your own notes, you had to have a certain amount of gold and silver on hand all the time. The Miners Bank, their balance sheet had shifted to notes from the Jackson County Bank in Michigan and another bank in Michigan, which were questionable, and so the state didn't like that, so they closed that down. And then also you have the Illinois Savings Bank, which had nothing to do with Illinois. This was actually run out of the president's brokerage office in St. Louis, and then the secretary lived in Burlington, Wisconsin, which is now Burlington, Iowa. So if you wanted to redeem them, you had to figure out where Burlington was and where the secretary lived, and take the notes down there to get your money back. And those other banks that used in the area, I mentioned Bank of Manchester, Bank of Jackson County. Ironically, one of the things that happened here that caused some controversy is the territorial treasurer, I think, having known that these banks were in trouble, spent out $7,000 in these notes to pay off the citizens of Burlington for money that the territory owed them for services and goods. And then shortly after that, the bank went under and everybody was stuck. So kind of transferred the loss from the state to the citizens real quick before the bank went under. So that was a controversy for many years after that. And then Hiram Price also wrote one of his items, the early bankers tool. Since you're using the out-of-state notes, you didn't even know exactly what the value was going to be. They had another industry they called the banknote reporter. These publications came out on a monthly basis, bi-weekly basis. So you get that, and that would tell you whether or not the bank notes that you have in your business are still good, or if they might be discounted and accepted an amount less than face value. And so that was your main tool, and the other tool was the Bible that printed that they held their value until the next time the reporter came out, or before you could get them out the door to give them to somebody else. And then kind of tied into the territorial period and the first charter when the state didn't, or when the government didn't like banks of issue, they wanted to prevent any notes in Iowa. They basically put into law a rule that if you issued any of these things locally, you could be fined or have jail time. And the fine was about $1,000, which today doesn't sound like that much. If you adjust it back for inflation, that's around $12,000 today. So kind of a big chunk of change if you did that. And they didn't really have a way to enforce this, so they set this up so it's kind of a self-governing process. So if you got caught doing this and it goes to court, $500 went to the county that prosecuted it, and $500 went to the person that fingered the issuer. So apparently it worked well. I think really there isn't any other notes found from this period because it was just too expensive and risky to try it. So then, necessity always works out a loophole. So a lot of Iowa bankers figured out they could go and acquire banks out of states and then bring those notes back to Iowa and use them in their offices as good money here. So Green and Ware, Cedar Rapids, and a number of another town around the state, they basically set up Western Exchange Fire and Marine Insurance Company in Nebraska. And they also acquired the charter for Fontenelle Bank in Nebraska. They use those notes here in Iowa. Cook and Sargent from Davenport, they chartered the bank in Florence, Nebraska. Those notes basically built their bank offices in Iowa City and Davenport. Bank of Nebraska was chartered by Benjamin Allen and Whit Sherman in Des Moines. E.W. Clark and Brothers had set up an office in Burlington. They used their notes. It's hard to see in the middle there that shows a lot of their office locations, but then they have put a note down here that it was redeemable in Burlington, Iowa. This was kind of an offshoot of their branch in St. Louis. The St. Louis branch got in trouble with Missouri because they weren't licensed to issue currency in Missouri. So that branch closed up. And when that happened, they sold the Iowa branch to another local banker, and they redeemed their notes and moved out of state. So both of these are relatively hard to find because both of the issuers redeemed these whenever they were presented. So for Des Moines area, Mr. Stevens bought a bank in Tennessee, brought the notes back here. He ended up going out of business because he put his stamp on these. The court ruled that he was responsible for all these. Didn't have the money to pay for them, so he used his contacts in Washington, got himself appointed ambassador to Canada, took off for a couple of years. When the heat kind of died down, he came back to Nebraska and started up the same thing again. So. And then Commercial Bank of Indiana and the Exchange Bank of Keokuk is still kind of a question, whether it's legitimate or whether it's fraudulent. There was no Exchange Bank in Keokuk. There were a number of banks there. The bank in Indiana, no one has any record of that existing. A lot of these were redeemed to start with. Kind of thought of maybe it's a wildcat to get it, redeem them so everybody has confidence with them and they start to accept them, and they kind of disappear and there's no one to take the notes anymore. When there was an article in 1920, 1930 from Keokuk where one of these notes had surfaced and they were talking to some of the older residents of the town, and one individual noted that they thought a number of these were discovered in the basement of an old bank building in Keokuk. So the question is, were they legit? Did they get stamped in Keokuk and used in the area, or did someone try to, create counterfeit notes and circulate them through based on some of the good names in Keokuk? So we haven't figured out that question, how that works. So, if it was actually legitimate, one of the side stories here is this: the imprints on the notes would have been done by the local printer at the time, and the local printer was Orion Clemens, and his brother had the job of mixing up the ink and setting the typeface, and that was Samuel Clemens. So there's, if this works out, then Mark Twain might have been the one that created this overstamp. So. And then with the second Constitution, the powers to be decided that we actually needed a banking system because everyone was losing their money and there was no confidence in the notes that were coming around. So they rewrote the Constitution. The banks of issue were allowed. We never actually had any takers. The restrictions on how much gold and silver you had to have was so strong that it didn't pay to go that route. So everyone continued on as private bankers. The big thing was that the penalty fee was removed. So that let everybody go ahead and issue their own notes without having to worry about getting fined or going to jail. And so this was just a big explosion. Kind of the biggest reference, the best reference right now is Dean Oak's books on the Iowa obsolete and script. And about 85% of the notes in his book come from this time period. So just a big jump in what was being issued at the time. And since timing is everything, we started with this in 1857. By late 1857, there was a wide financial panic. And so a lot of these issuers, instead of getting these out the door, they all folded and went under. And so a lot of people got stuck with worthless notes, even trying to make the system better. The one good thing it did is it created the State Bank of Iowa. That was kind of a governing body that had state representatives on it. And that body was able to license branches to function around the state. They ended up in all having 15 branches. The town had to be a certain size. You had to have a certain amount of investment in the bank to make it work. The governing organization was the one responsible for ordering the notes and distributing the notes just to make sure that there's enough money there to support what they're being issued. And then each of the banks in the system had to agree to redeem each other's notes. And so these were always considered good as gold. These were well used and well circulated. And just a couple examples from the time period, just a lot of variety of what was done. Tugett and Elliott were bankers in Lynn County, which is right Cedar Rapids is today. The Lynn County Bank with Winslow and Stevens and Co. was late in the game. They started in 1861. They converted to a national bank, redeemed all their notes, and so we only have a few surviving notes for collectors today. Baldwin and Dodge and Council Bluffs. When the Council Bluffs branch of the state bank began operating, they didn't see a need for these anymore, so they withdrew all their notes and paid them all off. So we only have remainders is all we can find today. And then Farmers and Merchants Bank is an example of the railroad took a bypass and went past them for a few miles, and everybody kind of moved and the town kind of died, and so the bank closed. They were nice enough to put an ad in the paper saying that they would redeem notes up to a certain date. Ad wasn't in a real local paper, so there's a lot of these that never got redeemed. So this is one issue that's fairly easy to find for collectors. A couple other banks, Nichols and Company in Glenwood, which is in western Iowa, kind of started out as a general store, got into banking and land speculation. They also were in good enough shape to pay off all their notes before these went away. Lumberman's Bank is kind of interesting in that Mr. Fuller's business was located in Michigan for the lumber mill. His house was in Illinois and his bank was in Iowa. So you kind of had to guess maybe where these were going to get redeemed. And I was kind of wondering if you bring it in and they just say, well, you need to go here. So they keep bouncing around between different locations to try and get your money back. Then the bottom two are also a little bit of a question mark. These both have a $2 value on them, but they've got a moniker of 100 and 1,000. There's also two other similar notes for a Park Bank and Brooklyn Bank. They're all the same design. They all mimic a little bit the Knuckles company notes as far as some of the basic layout. I think that the current thought here on these, they might have been created like after the fact, so late 1800s, early 1900s for the collector market. And then towns were issuing money left and right too. Burlington, a little safer than some of the others. They actually borrowed $20,000 to $30,000 in gold to back their notes, so they circulated these based on that. Got to the point where they didn't need them anymore and withdrew everything, so there's not very many of these existing. Keokuk and Iowa City, they basically issued their notes to pay for their expenses because they couldn't, no coin in circulation. You can't get tax money either, so you're issuing something to pay your bills with. They tried to redeem as many notes as were presented for these. The bottom left is a little harder to see, but that is the Corporation of McGregor, so McGregor, Iowa, basically. This was a little different in that they made these notes payable at the state bank branch in McGregor. So there's 3 or 4 of these arrangements with some of the towns in McGregor. The state bank wasn't allowed to issue anything under $1. They've always been curious if they didn't have some side arrangements with some of the business to try to do some fractional notes to help with the circulation in the town. Benton Sports on the Des Moines River was quite a trading spot at the time. Now there's 2 or 3 buildings there and a couple houses, so towns that disappear over time. Lion City also no longer exists. That kind of got rolled into Clinton, Iowa. Interesting thing here is these notes were issued for 2 years, 1857, 1858, and 1859. Over those 2 years, they have the signatures of 3 different mayors. So they had a lot of political turnover at the time because you have all these different signatures on these notes. And then the town of Cedar Falls also had a short run of notes to pay for some of their bills. City of Wapello, they have some of the nicest, probably some of the nicest design notes for Iowa. Wapello really never had an interest in actually issuing the notes. These got done kind of as a peer pressure thing. The bankers wanted something, the merchants wanted something, so the town acquiesced and agreed to have these printed on the condition that they wouldn't be responsible for them. So the local banks all said, yes, we'll take care of redemption. We just need something in our area that we can trust. And so we got these ordered and delivered, distributed. All the banks in the area then said no, except for one bank. So they tried to take it on, and that bank went under. And then another bank tried to use them in Burlington, and just too many people wanting to redeem them, not enough money. So both those banks that would agreed to accept them both went under. So these had no value very shortly after they were issued. There was one nice story we found here in congressional testimony. The senator named John Greer from Iowa, apparently when he was in his early days, he was an attorney in Burlington, and he had taken $600 of these notes in payment for his services, and he wasn't able to get them redeemed before the bank went under. And so he's put them away in his vault for a number of years. And during the Civil War, he came across a number of Keokuk was kind of a staging place for troops. And so a lot of troops in Burlington at the time. So he came across a bunch of troops that were in a group, and he pulled them out and divvied them up among troops. Said, take them with you and spend them down south because they don't know what the value is down there. And Southern currency was collapsing, so they were desperate for any type of good money that they would find. So Mr. Greer eventually became governor of Iowa. So, ethics and politics really make for interesting stories. Merchant scripts, just a lot of merchant script too. The 25-cent note upper left there was a bookseller in Davenport. The Dubuque and Central Improvement Company bought a couple islands in the river. Their plan was to fill it all in and expand the Dubuque waterfront and make money selling lots. They didn't. They went under before they could get their project done. The Iowa Land Company was formed basically to found the city of Clinton, Iowa. They're responsible for surveying and selling lots. And then the 50-cent note lower left there was Mr. Washburn in Davenport. That one has kind of a sad story. There happened to be a day in Davenport when a local attorney was in his office downtown. And he had loaned a rifle to somebody out that lived out of town. They brought it back. So it came back all rusty. So he and another friend were in the law office trying to figure out if this rifle was any good, if it worked. It accidentally went off. Now the bullet went out the front of the building. Mr. Watchman just happened to be walking by, got hit, and he died in the streets. So sad things. And I'm assuming since then that the business ended because these are easy to find. So there's a lot of these available for collectors. And then the top left one, a lot of these smaller notes, the 5-cent notes, these are all pretty simply made. There's not a lot of engraving or vignettes on these. This happened to be a general merchandiser, Davenport. Burroughs and Prettyman. They had kind of an interesting story. They got started out with a grain mill and a sawmill and got into the general store business. And then they kind of became an early version of Cargill. They went around and bought grain, hogs from all the farmers in the area. This time Iowa didn't have there was not an easy way to sell your product. So you'd grow everything, but it was hard to sell it and actually make any money. So they would go around and buy this at a low price, hire a riverboat captain to take it down to St. Louis or New Orleans by barge and sell it down there. So they were kind of the first grain business in the area. They ended up being tied to the Cook and Sargent, and when Cook and Sargent went under, they took Burroughs and Prettyman down with them too, because they had underwritten some loans to the bank to try and keep the bank afloat, and that didn't work. They all crashed together. So they're also kind of a little example of fraud. They're the day that the bank run started, the bank closed its doors. Mr. Burroughs went over to see what was happening, and he had been on his way to the bank with a deposit. So the county had things called county orders to pay their bills with. So he had a packet of these that he was going to take to redeem. With all the hullabaloo or the thing, he left them at the bank, and the city treasurer came in to complain about bills they owed, and the banker saw the pile of orders, and he gave it to him to pay the bank's bills. And so Burroughs and Prettyman were out because we got taken away from them. So he's also kind of an example of how these notes were issued. He liked to wear a stovetop hat, like President Lincoln, the tall black hat. He'd take the uncut sheets of notes and wrap them up and put them in the hat. He'd walk around with a pair of scissors in his vest pocket. So as he walked around town or out in the country buying grain or whatever he was buying, he'd just take a sheet out of his hat and cut out what he needed to buy the items. So Davenport and Rogers got started. They also got started out with like a flour mill and a sawmill. They ended up having a boatyard that employed about 100 people for a while. And then the next one that's another example of the state bank couldn't issue 10-cent notes, but Smith and Cannon was a business in Dubuque. They had these notes printed up to make them look like the state bank, and they were redeemable at the state bank. So kind of a dual purpose there. Another big issue for Iowa were the railroads. Railroads took off after 1858. Most of them didn't survive. Keokuk and Mount Pleasant got sold several times before it got finished. These notes are mostly redeemed, and so there's only a few remainders you can find today. Butte and Sioux City also got sold before they got finished. But there's very few of those notes. Great Western went under. There's a lot of those. You can usually find those on eBay. And then the one on the bottom right is always, I thought that's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting. Notice Keokuk Packet Company, which was a riverboat company. They were the first riverboat company that actually ran on a time schedule between St. Louis and Burlington, or Keokuk, excuse me. Before that, the boat kind of showed up at Portland. The boat showed up, so it's kind of a big thing. They are also supplied the two riverboats for the presidential debates for Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln in 1858. So. And then typically when you want banknotes, you contact the banknote printer, you kind of pick out the designs you want out of the catalog, you put it all together. They send you a proof sheet, and you prove that, and they send you printed notes. typically notes always come on a four notes per sheet. The Baldwin and Dodge notes are the only ones in Iowa we know about that were done in eight note sheet sets. You see these a little bit more with some of the Confederate notes were done this way. There are a few others I've seen around the country, but this is kind of unique to Iowa. And then I had attended a online webinar that Lynn Knight did a few years ago, and he talked about, well, you get the sheets, and then the bankers have to fill the serial numbers, you fill in the dates, you sign them, and then you cut them apart with scissors. I thought, So I was looking a little bit, and from the old catalogs actually have scissors that are a model made for bankers, called banker shears. And the picture doesn't quite do them justice, but they're, like this. So they're long enough you can cut like the whole sheet across and not have to do that. So then after the National Bank Act ended, the banks didn't need these more. So I've noticed the catalogs changed, calling these paper hanger shears for wallpaper. So. And as I mentioned, the state bank came into play. They ended up with 15 offices. They issued notes in $1, $2, $3, $5, and $10 denominations. All good as gold. Never an issue with these. Excuse me. It was very tight oversight. These all went back, and they were typically burned when they were redeemed. So there's not a lot of these left for collectors. They ended up with 2 issues. The first issue on the right there, basically you had to fill in all the information. So the name of the branch, the serial number, the date, the signatures. That didn't wear well. So you have all these notes that would you couldn't see the name of the branch anymore, or the serial numbers. And so then each bank was responsible for redeeming the other branches' notes. Get these, and you wouldn't know who to send them to get your money back with. So that came to an end for the first issue. They ordered another issue, or they printed those things on. Made it much simpler. And then the $5 note below, typically you can find these readily. These are actually counterfeits. So the way you know that counterfeits are, the gentleman on the note is Anton LeClaire. He was a prominent early Iowan. His hair is not done the way it was done on a authentic note. And then the big giveaway is on the lower left corner. I think you just see a little black line on there. That's actually the name of the banknote company, American Banknote Company. When the engraver did this, he flipped the A around, so the A is backwards on that. So it's an easy way to tell that. So that was the Oskaloosa branch. They were also counterfeited for the Council Bluffs branch. I think everyone is pretty sure it's the same plates. It might have been different people. There were a couple of arrests noted in the newspapers of the time for counterfeiters. Council Bluffs notes they fixed the A. The hair was still not an issue, but then one thing they did is the dates on these notes were actually before the bank started, and so the bank started in 1861, and these are dated 59, so that didn't match up. And then they used the same serial number on each side of the note. So the one side of the serial number was originally for the state bank. They numbered them all for all the branches. And then the other one was specific to that branch. So that branch had its own serial number system. So the notes had 2 different serial numbers. The counterfeiter did this. He didn't realize that. He put the same number on each side. So. And then there are a few notes that just still kind of have a tie to the present. Biderbeck and Miller, as I showed you this note earlier, they were a general merchandise business, and their grandson Bix ended up being a really prominent jazz musician in the roaring 20s. And so the community still has a jazz concert every year. And that's called the Bix Lives for Bix Biderbeck. So. And then Mr. Allen from Des Moines, if you've been to Des Moines or not, but we have a lovely governor's mansion. That was actually his home. He's the one that built that. He did this, and then when he got out of this bank, he organized the state bank in Des Moines. Got out of that, he got suckered into buying a failing bank, national bank in Chicago. He lost his fortune at that point. And so the house got bought by someone else in 1971. It was turned over to the state. It's been the governor's mansion since then. So a lot of publications have called it one of the finest examples of Victorian architecture between Chicago and California. So it's a very impressive building. And then by the 1860s, everything kind of started to settle down a little bit. The national banknotes were much more accepted, much more safe. They were started circulating in Iowa. The fractional notes issued by the Treasury were starting to circulate. So that kind of fixed the issue of the having not enough change in the markets. And then IRS legislation in 1866 basically taxed all the remaining obsoletes out of existence. If you tax 10% to use your notes, it's too much of an overhead cost to continue doing it. So, and then this little clipping is just that early box score. So your newspapers would typically print off and on a little listing of what notes in your area were good or bad. So in this example, like the city of Burlington script, discounted 5 cents, so it was worth 95 cents on the dollar if you were spending it or taking it. Burroughs and Pettyman and then Merchant Stewart's company below were known to be in trouble, so don't take those notes, don't accept those notes. The 5 other issuers in the middle there, including Wampalo, were all gone under by then, so they had no value. And then, like Fort Madison, Iowa City, those were all 25-cent discounts. They were worth 75 cents on the dollar and then 50 cents on the dollar for key effects. So you see these printed frequently in the local newspapers. And even then, it was such a scarcity. You'd see merchants that would advertise. They would actually still take these notes in hopes they would turn around. But they, unscrupulously take them out of the state and use them somewhere else, trying to get their money back out of them. So it's just kind of an interesting period on how things worked and how different it is from today. Today, you can take the $20 bill out of your billfold and take it anywhere in the world and spend it. It's $20. You have to think about, is it worth 10 cents today? Is it worth $1 today? So an interesting time period for collecting. So, and obsoletes, I always think is one of the most interesting paper money fields, just because of all the topics on the notes, all the different denominations. If you're collecting nationally, you can find $9 notes and $7 notes and $8 notes. Iowa was pretty standard with 1, 2, 3, 5, 10. The Miners Bank was the only bank we had that issued the $50 and $100 notes. The Western Exchange Insurance did a $20 note along with the Miners Bank, and then everybody else was typically $1, $2, $3, and $5 ranges. So those were kind of standard denominations for us. And then we talked about the bit, half bit and bit, 2-bit. So the bit with 12.5 cents, you can, if you look on eBay or probably here in the forest, you can find, it's like Ohio was a big state, a couple states where they actually issued 12.5-cent notes. That's what was circulating in the area. So that's how they did paper money. I did bring, this is, if you're interested in Iowa notes, this is probably the best book there is. This was done by Dean Oakes in 2015. It's out of print, so it's a little hard to find, but it's really nice in that it has a lot of color pictures for many notes for Iowa. So it's a nice book for the collector. Otherwise, any questions?
All righty. Okay, let me get the screen share stopped. Stop Zoom. Okay, then we're going to open it up for questions. We have one already online, and then we'll open it to the room here. Are you aware of Tiffany Brothers advertising notes issued in the early 1870s for various Iowa stores?
Yeah, actually, I just was able to buy one 2 weeks ago. One from Sioux City on eBay, so that was kind of a different thing. But and actually, Dean has a couple of those in his book. Those are actually depression script. I guess it depends on how you define obsoletes. Like the traditional obsolete definition is from the end of the Revolutionary War notes to the national bank notes in 1866. And we had a number of depressions after that. So 1873, 1901, there's where you come back from local merchants, you can find them printing notes to use in their stores again. So Iowa has several of those, and yeah, Tiffany notes are harder to find for Iowa. I don't see those very often, but there's I think 5 or 6 issuers that I can think of for those. But that was a national program, Tiffany Brothers. And I have not looked at it to know if that's like Tiffany, New York, that type of a thing, but they set up this program where you buy their notes and you can redeem them for a certain amount of merchandise store. It wasn't actual, it had a value to it, but you couldn't exchange it for actual coin cash. It was just like, it was a trade piece, kind of like what we think of maybe like coupons today type of a thing. So but yeah, they're an interesting added piece for the collector too.
All right. Do we have any questions here in Schaumburg? Yes.
Yes, were most of the notes that you showed there, were most of those printed by national or American banknote?
Most of these, so you had the panic in 1857. That's when the banknotes companies really figured out that they were losing their customer base because everyone's going under. And so the 6 biggest printers all combined and started out the national or American National. They each did their own thing with a bunch of smaller printers all combined to form those companies. So most of these notes were done before that. Oh, so yeah, the state banks were, the first issue was done by American Banknote Company. The second issue was done by the National Banknote Company. But most of the private notes you see on here, if they were that 1857, 1858 range, were a host of other printers around the country. A lot of them were based in Philadelphia and New York.
Okay, we don't have anything else online at this point. So anyone else here? Yes.
The book that you mentioned, I couldn't quite hear my hearing is very poor. Did you say that's available for sale somewhere?
It is out of print at the moment. So he also did the same book in 1882. That's black and white. That one actually has some more narrative than this one does. That one you can usually find on eBay most of the time. This one you have to search for because not a lot of people have passed these on yet. So.
Well, thank you.
Yes.
Yes. Do they keep records of the artist who came up with the vignettes that they used? Where would you find that information?
Oh, I don't know. Cliff, if you know more about that, I have not seen any records. I know, the American Banknote Company had a huge vault with all the. They kept the engraving plates for years and years. And it was at the 70s, they finally put that all up for auction. 70s, 80s, they put that up for auction. But I don't know if there's any records that actually show who.
I can say for the period I worked with, which is the 1830s, it's virtually impossible to attribute this stuff by artists.
Yeah, I always thought if we had the record to know how many notes were printed for each of these issuers, it would help us as collectors figure out, what was out there at least.
Yeah.
There was one group we found. It was an engraver in his personal papers. There was a group of about 40 banknote groups. We're assuming he was the artist for them.
Right.
So that's about the best you can do.
Yeah. I know and I can't remember which ones there. There's 1 or 2 Iowa notes where if you get a really good magnifying glass, you look at the vignette, there's a name in there, but it takes a really good magnifying glass to see that.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, we don't have any others in the room, so this is the last call for anyone online if you want to send them in. Otherwise, that'll wrap us up. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be starting the next presentation at 3 o'clock Central with Greg Rohan from Heritage Auctions speaking about the current numismatic market. So I hope you'll join us for that. Otherwise, the next Iowa State Showcase presentation is tomorrow at 1:30. We will have the last 3 of the day are all part of the Iowa series. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining.